So, the NHS is turning 75 years old, but with all its stresses and strains, is it fit to last?
A day in the stands after a big plan for the NHS, alongside some other VIPs tucking into the spread. But hitting 75 is not the same as being in rude health. The NHS has the highest waiting lists on record, and plans for thousands more staff might not make much difference for years to come.
We need more doctors and nurses to ease the pressures, and we need reform.
So the pressure's on for both our main parties to show how they'd fix the health service.
The longer the Conservatives are in power, the longer patients will wait. Labour has a plan to deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history.
A big birthday for our biggest institution is on the way. So our main question this morning, how confident can you be in the plans to fix the NHS?
Amanda Pritchard, chief of the NHS in England and the boss of more than 1 million people, is here for the first time. Labour's Bridget Phillipson is vying to make the grade with new plans to get the best teachers in our schools. And with the NHS at the top of the list, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, is here too. And we'll hear from the first female astronaut heading to the moon. Morning, and with you and me for the next 60 minutes at the table, the science presenter Michael Mosley, who trained as a doctor, the former health minister James Bethell, and the online campaigner for kids safety Beban Kidron, both of you members of the House of Lords. A very warm welcome to my panel this morning. Now, it's interesting, if we take a look at the front pages this morning, they're all over the place actually in terms of stories. The Sunday Telegraph has a story about electricity pylons, but that picture that is almost everywhere of the Prime Minister, the future King, and the other future King stuffing his face with pizza at the cricket. That picture is in lots of the papers this morning. The Mirror leads on a story about the sixth suspect in the Stephen Lawrence murder case. That was a story that was broken by the BBC last week. Stephen's friend, whose name you might be familiar with, Dwayne Brooks, says the suspect was there when that terrible event took place. But the front of The Sun on Sunday, a very different story about the Conservative peer Zac Goldsmith. Now, they're talking about his friendship with the pop star Ellie Goulding. But of course, he made the news earlier this week when he quit the government with a blast at Rishi Sunak on the environment. And our story here at the BBC this morning, leading the news, is the fifth night of rioting in France. We can show you some of these latest pictures from overnight trouble in the southern city of Marseille. Well, let's get on with our main topic of discussion this morning, because the NHS is turning 75 this week, which of itself is an extraordinary achievement. But everyone watching this morning, Michael, knows that a lot is going wrong. What would your diagnosis be?
I think that, it's an interesting way forward, but I fear that they're really ignoring the main problem, which is the rising rates of obesity, and particularly in childhood, and what you do about that. And I made a series a couple of years ago, for Channel 4 called Who Made Britain Fat? And the short answer was, broadly speaking, ultra-processed food, junk food. At that time, Boris had nearly died from COVID. He seemed to have a plan, three pieces of the plan, including restricting the advertising of, junk food after the watershed. Almost everything has been ditched. One piece went through, everything else has been sort of pushed into the long grass.
And I'm sure we'll get to that role of government later in the programme. I mean, James, you were working at the Department of Health. How bad do you think things are right now?
Well, I was there during the pandemic and I saw the NHS at its best. It is an institution that can innovate incredibly quickly, and I have no doubt about the commitment of the people who work there. I worry, though, that they've got the wrong doctrine. To echo these points, the doctrine is that we can operationally optimise the NHS, a sort of yo-ho, heave-ho, one last push and we can be a bit better. I think that there should be a much greater focus both on things like obesity to try and make the country healthier, on things like mental health and the problems that our children are having with the internet. And we've got to prevent disease. The ambition should be to make the country healthier, not to treat the sickness faster.
So those are the overall kind of big picture, that maybe there does need to be a change of attitude. But Beeben, there is something, though, extraordinary about the health service, isn't there, in this country? I mean, who could have dreamt in its founding days, 75 years ago, that all of these years later, and such a changed society, would still be here?
No, I mean, it's fantastic, and we all pay tribute to those people who work in the NHS. But I think the two questions that sort of remain, one is really around how to retain the existing workforce, how to make them happy, how to pay them properly in the long run. And the other thing is about social care. If every political party keeps on throwing that down the line, we'll never fix the NHS upstream.
And that's certainly something we've talked a lot about in this studio, and I'm sure we'll pick up a bit later in the programme. And as Beeben was saying, the NHS is held in such deep affection, but we know from you it is a source of huge frustration too. Statistics suggest 90% of us do back the NHS, but satisfaction with services is the lowest it's ever been. And in the last few days, many of you, patients and staff, have been in touch with us here at the BBC to share some of the pride, but also some of the pain.
I had an emergency C-section with my baby girl at the end of April, and unfortunately 4 weeks postpartum, I had an emergency appendectomy. Then, sadly, a week after that, we were readmitted to hospital with a virus for my baby. I really appreciated everything the NHS did for us.
The unrelenting pressure faced on a daily basis, combined with a knock-on effect to patient care, ultimately led to me burning out. We need a healthy workforce to break this unsustainable cycle.
Rapidly diagnosed with kidney cancer in November 2022. But since then I've had a very long and anxious and very frustrating wait with delays for surgery, which is not scheduled until later this month. It's not good enough, like.
Well, the highs and some of the lows. The NHS treats 1 million people a day, and it has more than 1 million staff. Their boss, Amanda Pritchard, is the chief of NHS England, is here for the first time. We're delighted to have you with us at this special occasion for the NHS. I suppose initially, really straightforwardly, is the care people get right now good enough?
Well, Laura, thank you for having me this morning. And I think it is a momentous week for the NHS for two reasons. One, we're coming up to our 75th birthday, but the other, we have just launched our long-term workforce plan. And actually, if we're going to talk about the care that people receive, I think it is helpful in some ways to look back and see what's happened over the last 75 years to get us here, but also just to think about what we've been through in the last few years. So with the COVID pandemic, with the busiest winter, certainly that I can recollect in my 25 years in the health service, and then with the ongoing pressures through industrial action. So it is a period of almost unprecedented challenge. And of course, patients are feeling that. We just heard Kevin talk about some of the frustration that he's experienced, and his frustrations are shared by, everyone who works in the NHS. Nobody wants anyone to wait a minute longer than they need to. But that's why we are doing so much, and have been over the last really 18 months or so, to really focus on recovering services and getting things back to a stage where we are able to meet exactly the sorts of needs that patients have.
But right now it's not good enough.
Well, right now, it's absolutely the case that some people, many people are waiting far longer than they would like, but also that we would like.
Are you frustrated? You used the word frustration.
Well, I think it's back to just being really clear that everyone in the NHS shares the same desire to treat people as quickly as possible, without delay, to be able to give patients exactly the care that they would themselves want. Don't forget, as you say, we've got 1.3 million people work for the NHS. Many of them are patients as well. I'm a patient as well as a member of staff. And so, we all want the best for our colleagues. We all want the best for our staff. But what we're doing is recognising, I think, as our medical director said, right back at the beginning of the pandemic, he said it would be at least a 5-year journey. So we're only 3 years in, and we've already made big strides, in particularly bringing down some of our longest waits, whilst also innovating and working differently so that we can be more sustainable for the long term.
And we'll talk about the long term a bit later on, but right now then it will be another 2 years before people can expect things to be back at a decent level.
Well, recovery takes time. So at the moment we've seen real progress, particularly with the longest waits, so virtually eliminated 2-year waits. We've reduced the number of people waiting over 78 weeks by 90%. We're on to the next big challenge,
but
which
to be
is
really
65
explicit on that,
weeks.
though, you said a moment ago it would be 5 years to get back to normal after the pandemic. We're 2 years in, so people are going to have to wait another few years before we can expect things to be as good as you would like them to be.
So I think specifically on waiting times, what we've always recognised, in fact, when the previous Secretary of State announced the recovery plan back last year, 18 months ago, he said very clearly, look, waiting lists are going to go up before they come down, but we are still on track to deliver the fastest reduction, the fastest improvement of waiting times in our history. But it is not an overnight thing. It's not a magic
at record
wand.
levels, so you can look forward to them coming down, but they are right now at record levels, and that's having such consequences for people. One of our viewers, Stephen from Harrow, got in touch to tell us he's been told his 4-year-old son will have to wait between 50 and 70 weeks, more than a year, for a 4-year-old. So like lots of people around the country, they're now thinking, should they pay £3,000 for private treatment? I mean, what would your advice to someone like that be?
So I absolutely get the frustration. And as I say, I'm a patient as well. My own family are going through different bits of treatment for different things and experiencing waiting on the other side. But what I would just reassure people is, this isn't an overnight fix. But we are, and I speak for all my colleagues in the health service, working tirelessly to make sure that what we have done, which is set out the most ambitious recovery plan in our history, we are continuing to deliver.
And nobody doubts your motivation.
So no one's saying, and just to be clear, no one's saying that this is going to be something where, it is anything other than a combination of just continuing to deliver that reduction from the longest waits down, which we've made big improvements in already, as well as, we have to do this. We have to keep innovating and doing things differently.
We'll come to the long term later, but this is a problem of right now. What should someone in that kind of situation do? Should they scrape to try and find £3,000, or should they wait more than a year for treatment for their 4-year-old?
So children and young people is an area of particular focus for us. We know that the pandemic hit kids really badly. I'm sure it's something we'll come on with your other guests to talk about. So it's been particularly the case in mental health services as well as physical health services. But we are focusing on children and young people as a particular focus area as we bring down weights overall. So I'm really sorry to hear about that particular example, but what I can say is we're already making big progress in reducing the longest weights. We're on next to making sure we're doing the next thing, and to bringing us down to 65 weeks. We're continuing to focus on the most urgent patients, and we are doing things differently. So we're bringing diagnostics into the community with new community diagnostic centres. We're doing things like robotic surgery. We're using AI to speed up the way that we can diagnose. So all the time, we're also not just bringing weights down by doing things traditional ways. We're doing things differently as well to innovate, to make sure we are speeding up recovery as much as we can.
And we've heard a lot this week about the long-term workforce plan for thousands more doctors and nurses in the future. But what has been announced this week that would stop a junior doctor getting on a plane to go to Australia where they can earn more and work less, or would stop a nurse looking at their pay packet and go, you know what, I can get a job at the supermarket, we've heard here in this studio, that it's going to pay me more than those tough shifts in the wards?
So I think, there's a lot in that question, and we should probably talk about in a moment, you'll want to talk about industrial action, I'm sure, but you would expect me, I think, as Chief Executive of the NHS to say, I will always want, NHS staff to be appropriately recognised for their skill, for their dedication, but pay is a matter for government and the unions. So what we have done, my job, is to make sure that in the long-term plan, we have done something which does speak to today, but also for the first time ever, actually gives us a path to a sustainable staffing model for the NHS. And that matters for
and you're
staff in the NHS
but right now
as well.
Right now there are 1 in 10 vacancies.
Yeah.
How have you allowed that to happen?
Yeah. Well, so that's part of why the fact that for the first time ever we've now got a chance to do long-term workforce planning makes such a big difference. But how have you allowed it to get to
this situation where 1 in 10 posts across the NHS is vacant?
So that goes to training, and are we training enough people for the NHS's needs? That's the reason why having a long-term plan, first time a government's ever asked the NHS to do this, allows us now to plan to make sure that we are training enough people over the long term so that we can see a position where we will be much more sustainable from a staffing perspective.
Simply, we haven't trained enough people, and that's why vacancies are so high.
But I would say, there are 2 other really important aspects to the plan, because what we also talk about in it is retention, and it is reform. So the retention part of it is about making sure, and there are some immediate things in there, that the things that we know really matter to people. So it matters to them that they've got enough colleagues with the right skills to be able to do their best work every day. And this gives real hope for that. But it also matters to people they've got clear career paths. So for a nurse, it might be about recognising that we're doing this as part of the plan, that we can now offer more advanced clinical training so that you can take your career forward. Equally, it really matters to people they've got flexibility to fit around busy lives, and that's a commitment that we've made in the plan.
As you've touched on already, it really matters to people how much they're paid. Now, we know it's not your responsibility, but do you think that doctors and nurses in this country are worth more than they are paid?
Well, as I say, look, I'm the Chief Executive of the NHS. I'm always going to say, aren't I? I want to make sure that our staff are appropriately recognised and rewarded.
Are they worth more than they're paid right now?
Well, that pay is a matter for unions and government, but my job is to make sure that whilst that is going on, we're doing our best to support the NHS through what is now an unprecedented period of industrial action.
Well, it is.
To mitigate the risks to patient safety and to minimise disruption. But unfortunately, going back to something we were talking about earlier on, there has been a significant amount of disruption, and that is only at the moment going to get more significant as we hit the next round of strikes. So that's 7 out of 8 days in the middle of July where we'll see action. And the truth is, the hard truth is, it is patients that are paying the price for the fact that all sides have not yet managed to reach a resolution on this.
And that's a nightmare, isn't it? I mean, the next round of strikes might include consultants, senior doctors. So up until now, senior doctors have been able to cover for junior doctors.
Yeah.
Junior doctors can't cover for senior doctors. I mean, are people's lives at risk?
Well, so so your point is exactly right. Consultants going out on strike is a different level of challenge again to what we've had to respond to with junior doctors, because they can't cover in the same way. But our priority has always been, through all these periods of industrial action, to work with colleagues across the NHS and unions to make sure that patient safety is mitigated and those risks are mitigated as much as possible.
Should people stay away from hospital if the standard of care that they can expect is just not going to be there? Logically, from what you've said, the standard of treatment is not going to be available. Should people stay away?
Well, the commitment so far, I have to say, from unions as well as from across the NHS has been to prioritise patient safety, and the messages we would always continue to give, apart from use NHS services sensibly, of course, and what that means is, if you can go to a local pharmacist, as you increasingly can for your routine care, or go to your GP, do so. But if you need the NHS, absolutely please come forward. Services will be running, particularly urgent emergency care services will be running, and we will all be doing everything we can to ensure patient safety.
Have you got any sense of optimism about when the strikes will be sorted? I mean, you sound like you're very worried about the situation. When do you think they'll be sorted?
Well, I think that's a conversation you might want to have with the Secretary of State later on in the programme, because I wouldn't have
Would you call on them to get on with it? Because clearly patients are being put at risk by this, from what you've said.
Well, so there is no doubt that the sooner that we can bring this to a resolution, the better for patients, because we've already had well over 500,000 appointments rescheduled as a consequence of industrial action. And I've been, as a junior manager, I was there ringing patients, having to tell them that their appointments were being changed, and it's a heartbreaking thing to do. And I know how frustrating that is for patients. So the sooner that we can bring this to an end, the better. We can't let it become business as usual for the NHS.
We've been looking at the NHS in the last couple of days in quite a lot of detail, and there's something interesting going on. You've got more staff than you've ever had before, you've got more money than you've ever had before, and yet so many of the indicators are going in the wrong direction, and actually fewer people have been treated. Now that doesn't sound like an organisation that's being well run.
So we've got at the moment, actually, I think, some really positive signs. I mean, you've obviously quite rightly said, huge disruption from industrial action. We've had this incredibly busy winter. I mean, demand is at record levels across the board. But we are seeing some really encouraging signs. So, for example, on emergency care, urgent emergency care, we've seen consistent improvement in ambulance response times over the last 3 months.
Levels. I mean, does it look like to you like an organisation that is well run?
A&E performance.
Because if you look at a lot of the indicators are in the wrong direction. You've got more money than ever before, more staff than ever before, and so many things are going in the wrong direction.
But I'm not sure I agree with you, to be honest. I think almost all our indicators actually going in the right direction at the moment. But what we have to recognise is
with more people
partly
waiting than ever before and fewer people treated, even though you've got bigger budgets.
So numbers of patients, you're absolutely right, that's going up. And as we've always said, that was going to get bigger before it came down. But the longest waits are reducing and are reducing consistently. We've got more patients being seen in GP surgeries every day than ever before. Actually, it's 1.6 million a day who are seen overall by the NHS, but nearly 1 million of those in primary care. It's 30 million more patients a year now over the last 12 months than pre-pandemic. We've got more patients being seen for cancer checks, more of them are being diagnosed early, and we're seeing an impact on survival rates. We're seeing the longest waits come down. We're seeing ambulance waiting times and A&E performance improving. Now, I don't want to be in any way suggest that we haven't got a huge challenge ahead of us, and we have, and we're only part way through that recovery journey. But actually, it's not just on those measures that I would say we have cause for optimism. It's new services that we're putting in place, new ways of working all the time,
what I want to ask you
as well as keeping on doing these core things.
Because society is unrecognisable in many ways.
Absolutely.
From when the NHS was founded. And today, the NHS has announced more gambling clinics, and you've said people are being bombarded with messages from the gambling industry to try to entice them in. Would fewer people fall into addiction if the gambling industry was more tightly regulated?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, I think, to say that society has changed. So back in 1948, when the NHS was founded, you had to go to a bookie shop to place a bet. Now it's 24/7 on people's phones. So, unsurprisingly, we're seeing a really significant increase in demand. And for people who have got severe gambling addiction, it's a really cruel disease, and it's a life destroyer. So we've announced today we're opening 7 more clinics. That brings the total to 15 specialist clinics. But I think it isn't just the NHS's responsibility, it is a wider societal responsibility. So, of course, I would really like it if the gambling industry, and not just the gambling industry, it's people like, football clubs. We've had 3 this week that have entered into deals with gambling industry providers for shirt sponsorship, which means that it's kids that are seeing every day now messages that says gambling's okay. And I think actually it would be really great to see the gambling industry and also organisations like football clubs really think seriously about their responsibilities here too.
There's so much we could talk about, but just before we close, I want to ask you, as the newish boss of the NHS in England, you've got one of the most important jobs in the country. How should, in the coming years, people judge what you achieve?
Thank you. I think partly this goes to some of the things your guests were talking about before. There is an absolute here and now challenge, and we are really clear and really focused on that. But we cannot only think about the things that are relevant today. We've got at the same time to be doing the things that are going to make us able to deal with the needs of a changing, growing, ageing population. So prevention is hugely important. It's one of the reasons why our integrated care systems are so well placed to bring together NHS, voluntary sector, local government, to know their populations, to offer things like targeted health checks. It's about getting the COVID vaccination to the right people, things like blood pressure checks in pharmacies, making sure that we're equally focused on prevention. Second thing I'd say, it's also about innovation. So you should be holding me to account to make sure that we're not just using today's answers for today's problems, we're also looking for tomorrow's solutions, and we are. So that's AI in the way that we diagnose cancers. That's thinking about not just how we use things like robots, but it's the blood test that we've now rolled out at trial to identify up to 50 different types of cancer. And I would say critical to that, it's also thinking about what are the new problems. So dementia. We've got potentially 1 million people in this country who've got dementia now. It's the biggest killer in the UK. So early trial, it's some early indications are that there are things that could be happen. Effective to help to delay the progression of Alzheimer's. So what am I doing about that was hugely complicated. We've got to wait for the green light if there is one. Regulators have got a job to do to work out whether or not it's the benefits, the risk, the cost benefit. But we are already thinking about, and we're already thinking about what would it take in terms of scanning capacity, what would it take in terms of the ability to actually deliver these drugs. And I've set up a team in NHS England already working with colleagues so that we get ahead and we're ready if we get the green light.
It's quite some to-do list, and we know you're extremely busy with all of that, and I hope you'll come back soon to tell us about some other of those projects as they develop. But it's been great having you with us this morning at such a busy time. Amanda Pritchard, thank you very much indeed. Well, what did you think of what she said? Of course, you can let us know. Send me an email, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or use the hashtag if you are social media inclined, BBC Laura K. Right, let's see what our panel had to make of it. Michael, as somebody who watches the NHS closely, lots of experience of it, do you think that she really addressed how critical things are right now?
I mean, obviously, going forward is hugely important. She talked about retention. I qualified in the 80s, and recently I had a reunion with my colleagues who'd been there, then in their late 50s, thinking about early retirement, and I kind of went round and said, what is it that's going to keep you in the NHS? And they said the thing that's primarily driving them out was actually fear of litigation, of being sued. That was number one, of, patients deciding that they'd been badly treated, whether they had or not, and then the whole process incredibly long and tedious. My wife's GP, and she's been through 2 complaint procedures without any merit, but that basically would have kicked her out the NHS in no time at all. So it's not an area that's been addressed at all. I have a son who's just come back from Australia. He went there for a couple of years. He has come back because he misses friends and family. But loads of my contemporaries went off to Australia and the States and never came back. About 10-15% of the year. And this was back in the 80s. And it was partly money, working conditions, but it was also career prospects. And she addressed that, but there isn't a lot of detail in there. I mean, junior doctors, you can be a junior doctor, you can be in your late 30s, 40s, and you've done all the training, and there is no prospect of progressing because the roles do not exist. So
that's a big. So working conditions and career prospects for staff. James, when you were just listening to Amanda there talking about what it's like in the NHS, and of course it's her job to try to highlight the positives, but as somebody who was in the Department of Health, do you think that they are being honest enough about how serious the situation is?
I had a huge lot of sympathy for the way Amanda put it. She is right that the service that the NHS delivers to patients is very high standard. It's a really great national service. It just doesn't deliver it to everyone. And you had that clip from Kevin, who was waiting for kidney treatment for 8, 9, 10 months. That, Laura, is rationing. That is not a logical clinical decision. If someone has a need for an operation and you simply don't have the resources to give them what they need, then you're going beyond the important protocols of allocating scarce resources in the best way possible, and you're being defined by the amount of resources you have available.
It's interesting you use that word, because often it's a word that politicians and people in the health sector might use privately. They say actually basically waiting lists are like rationing, but you now are saying that publicly as someone who's been a health minister.
I think that there is a difference between reasonable allocation of resources and making tough decisions, which is part of everyday life, and having to cope with a system that's overwhelmed with illness. It breaks my heart to be talking about gambling clinics and spending money mopping up the waste from gambling and casinos when there's someone waiting for a kidney operation. That makes no sense at all. That is not a way that we're scapegoating the NHS with far too much of society's problems, and they can't cope with all the illness there is in society.
And I'll talk to Biban in a second, but a lot of people would say your party, the Conservative Party, bear some of the responsibility for that because they haven't regulated in the way that some medics and some campaigning groups have wanted.
Well, these are challenges that are faced by all Western governments at the same time.
That wasn't my question.
We are living with the consequences of the way that the NHS was designed in its very early days. But you are right that this government should be doing more to change the environment in which people live. We need to have an environment where we get rid of the dirty air, the junk food, the gambling, the toxic workplaces, so that overall the population is healthier. The NHS can't possibly cope if we don't do that.
You're referring to dementia, which is now the #1 killer of women in the UK. The most dramatic thing that ever happened to dementia was banning smoking in pubs. You saw in the years afterwards rates of dementia drop, rates of heart disease dropped, and then they started to rise because people have started to put on weight. But that was in some ways a really simple thing to do, but it was also in some ways a very brave thing to do, but it had a dramatic effect.
Well, let's talk about a different kind of regulation. So our viewers will remember, Biban, you've been with us a couple of times before when we've talked about the harm that people being online is doing, particularly to children, and you've been working very closely on that, the laws as they rumble through Parliament. So where are things at now? And actually, should we look at it like a health problem?
I definitely think we should look at it as a health problem, and it's interesting, this conversation. We're talking about what is business outsourcing into public services. What are public services, in this case the NHS, maybe the education sector, are picking up from the lack of regulation. I'm happy to report, for once, that we are making some progress on the online safety bill, and you will remember Judy Thomas coming on this programme, and there was she had lost her daughter, and there was not a dry eye in the studio. Now the government have come forward and have agreed that coroners will get access to data as a result of the bill. I think it is a huge step forward. But the real thing is we want less dead children. Very important that we actually have these humane routes, and the bereaved families for online safety, I pay tribute to them. They have absolutely been there every step of the way as we have fought for safety by design. And as a result of all of that, we are going to get rules of the road around age checking, and it has to be effective for pornography and for high risk situations like self-harm and suicide. Government have brought forward some new offences around intimate image sharing, and we are really making progress on making sure that AI harms are treated as harms. Doesn't matter whether a human being or a machine created it, it's harmful to kids, it's in the bill. Yeah. So we are making progress, still a bit of work to do. And I think that one thing I will pick up from what was just said is the lack of provision around mental health services for children. They're not close enough, they're not quick enough, and there's not enough of it when you finally get access. And I think that is a now problem, not a in 15 years problem.
Okay, well, the problems of today quickly become the problems of tomorrow if they're not dealt with, as Amanda Pritchard was suggesting. But really interesting. I think actually for once our panel is agreeing on a lot this morning, which is a nice thing in political conversation. Thank you all very much indeed for now. Now, as we've heard, it is 75 years since the NHS was founded, but believe it or not, it is more than 25 years ago since this.
Ask me my 3 main priorities for government, and I tell you: education, education, and education.
Well, tomorrow the now opposition leader on the up, Keir Starmer, will make his big promises for our classrooms. And the woman who wants to be Labour's next Education Secretary is Bridget Phillipson, and she's back with us this morning. Hi. Thank you for coming in to talk to us today. Now, you're announcing today you want to bring in payments to encourage teachers to stay in the classroom after they've done a couple of years, I think £2,400. But the government's been doing this for years in a variety of different ways, and teachers seem to be leaving in droves. So why do you think it would work?
So this week, together with Keir Starmer, I'm setting out Labour's mission around education and opportunity and how we break down those barriers that exist for too many of our young people. I want to make sure that background doesn't limit you getting on. A really important part of how I believe we can deliver that is making sure we have excellent teachers in every classroom. So first of all, making sure that all new teachers coming into the profession are qualified teachers. That isn't the situation at the moment. Alongside that, reforming the very complicated set of different systems and arrangements that we have for different payments that are made to teachers. But in addition, extra payments, incentive payments for teachers who've completed their first 2 years of that new early careers framework, because I think the best recruitment strategy is about having a great retention strategy, and at the moment we face a really big challenge.
But as I said, the government's had different forms of this for quite a long time. So there's been, I think, £5,000 was dangled once for maths teachers to stay on, and different amounts in different subjects. And in some subjects like art and PE, I think you have more than enough teachers. So why would it make any difference to offer everybody a bung to stay on? Because that doesn't seem to be working.
It's about respecting and valuing the professionalism of teachers. What I hear, the length and breadth of the country, and I've been in this post now for just over 18 months, I had lots of time to speak to teachers and school leaders. What they tell me is that they want the status of teaching restored once more. I want to reset that relationship between government and the profession, and I want to make sure that all children have an excellent teacher in the front of their classroom.
So on that specific question,
on the different payments that are there, we need to bring together and consolidate that very complicated landscape where different pots of money are used for that. But I think when people have trained as a teacher and they've done that 2 years of really important professional development and training, I think that should be recognised at the end. I think that the change that we've seen around that is welcome, but we don't see enough support at the end of that process. this isn't the only change that we need to see, to be clear. We need to put better support into our schools around mental health provision. Lots of teachers will tell me that they're dealing with more and more challenges for young people, and they don't feel necessarily that confident, and they're not the professionals to deliver it. I also am determined to deliver reform of Ofsted too, because that is what drives so much where it comes to workload pressures for our school leaders. But teachers and school leaders deserve a bit of respect from their government, and under this Tory government they've had nothing of the sort.
We've talked a lot about Ofsted, actually. We've spoken to you about it before, as well as the Chief Inspector of Schools, but you've mentioned a couple of times this plan to make every teacher have the qualified teacher status. But it is already the case that most teachers have that. But also there are lots of extremely good schools where teachers don't have to have it, because in academy schools, for example, lots of successful ones of them all around the country, or in private schools, lots of successful ones of them all around the country, people don't have to have that certificate. So what is the merit in making everybody have the same piece of paper?
Because it's about respecting teaching as a skilled profession and making sure that all teachers have the ability to engage in ongoing professional development and training. The most effective way that you get better outcomes for children in schools is by having brilliant teachers. All of the evidence is clear about that. There are currently 14,000 teachers working across our schools who are not fully qualified. As a parent, I would like the children in front of my children, the teachers in front of my children, to be fully qualified. They work really hard, and that is what parents would, and that's what parents would want too.
The qualified
but it's about the
status.
It's about the new teachers coming in. I don't want to see teachers leaving. We can't accommodate. We can't deal with anyone leaving the profession at the moment. But new teachers who are coming into the profession, the expectation is when they are working in state schools, maintained schools or academies, they will be required to have or be working towards qualified teacher status.
And you are right to say that lots of people are leaving. I mean, we can show our viewers the numbers are absolutely staggering. It was almost 44,000 left the profession just last year alone. But what's your evidence that forcing everybody working in a state school to have this piece of paper, this certification, would actually make any difference and stop them leaving? Most of them have already got this qualification, and yet that many have left.
That's why what I'm setting out today is a range of different measures. I think it's about firstly raising the status and standing of teaching, expecting all teachers to be qualified.
But what's your evidence that this change would make any difference?
All of the evidence is very clear that the quality of teaching is the single biggest way you get better outcomes for children where it comes to what happens within the school.
But what's your evidence that this change would make any difference to that?
Because I think it is clear that the evidence is pushing at that in terms of the quality of teaching being the most effective intervention. I think parents would expect it too, and it will be a vital means by which we drive up standards in our schools. But of course there are other changes, as I say, right across the board that we need to see alongside that. This is the first part of what we're setting out this week around Labour's very ambitious plans to make sure that no matter where you're from, no matter what your background, you get the chance to get on in life. That's what really matters to me. That will be my priority if I were Education Secretary, because I know how important education is. It transformed my life. I was so lucky and so fortunate to have a brilliant school that believed and valued me for who I was and really pushed us to achieve. But I want that for all children. I don't just want it to be about luck.
And your motivation is clear, but when we look at your proposals, they don't seem to match what you say is a huge, ambitious vision for this. They're more like tweaks around the edges.
Dealing with the recruitment and retention crisis we're facing in our schools will have to be a really big priority for an incoming Labour government. What we're seeing at the moment with more teachers leaving than teachers we have coming in, with the big pressures that they're under at the moment, the really enormous challenges they tell me they're facing where it comes to dealing with more children with mental health pressures, children who are not in stable homes, who are facing the prospect of homelessness, rising levels of child poverty.
Is that you've identified and everyone knows this is a big problem, but you're talking about tweaks to the system.
No, the other plans we've set up, for example, around delivering breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England, that is also about making sure that, yes, we're responding to the cost of living pressures that families are facing at the moment. But again, the evidence is so clear about the impact that breakfast clubs have on children's attainment, on their attendance at school, on their behaviour. So there are a range of different measures that we will need. But it's about putting education right at the heart of national life once more. I could say lots of things about the approach that the government has taken, the fact it's been a peripheral issue for a very long time, the fact we've had 5 secretaries of state in such a short space of time. It has not been a priority for this government. It will be a priority for an incoming Labour government. It's how we change lives.
And isn't, though, the biggest issue for people in the profession what they're being paid? Now, it's expected that the review body, the independent group, will recommend that pay should go up by 6.5%. Would that be reasonable?
It is absolutely a big issue. It comes up a lot, as does workload.
So
I want to see that report published by the independent peer review body. We believe that to be the figure, although none of us, apart from the Secretary of State and the Treasury, are aware of that exact figure. We're facing the prospect of strike action this week. Strike action, I would rather, was not happening, because I don't want to see disruption to our children's education. But the way we might avert that, and there's still time, is for the Secretary of State to publish that report. Let's see the detail of it and commit to talks. There is no way we can get through any of that if you're not prepared to talk. And as I understand it, there have been no proper discussions about this since April.
But if you were the
little
Education
wonder we're
Secretary,
facing this disruption.
But if you were the Education Secretary, which is what you want to be, is 6.5% a reasonable offer?
If I were the Education Secretary, I wouldn't be coming on your programme and plucking a figure out of the air.
I'm not asking you to pluck a figure out of the air. I'm asking you if that's reasonable.
I wouldn't expect the current Education Secretary to do that either. My priority and my focus would be having proper and serious negotiations with the teaching unions to try and get a way through this on pay, on workload, on the status of the profession, and on wider issues that we see across education. That isn't happening. It's the Secretary of State's failure to get that to happen that means this week we're going to see more disruption. It is on them. That is an irresponsible and reckless approach. I want to be serious about the challenges. I'll be realistic about what we can do. But I know that teachers don't feel valued and appreciated for their work. Pay is a part of that. Under Labour, teachers, last time around when we were in government, teachers got real terms pay increases. Under the Conservatives, it's on average a 13% real terms pay cut since 2010. Labour governments always want to prioritise education and make sure we properly support people working in teaching with fair and affordable pay settlements. But who knows what the situation will be if we win that election, because the Conservatives crashed the economy, have behaved utterly recklessly, and that will present some tough choices.
OK, Bridget Phillipson, I know the Conservatives would deny that, but we'll be talking to the Health Secretary in a few minutes' time. But thank you very much, Steve, for coming us in, and we'll be interested to hear what Keir Starmer has to announce tomorrow. And maybe kids across the country might be talking this week about the Euclid mission.
3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff.
A European space telescope that blasted off yesterday from Florida on a quest to work out what the universe is made of, no less. And I'm sure you remember, if you've been with us for a few months now, next year NASA is planning to send humans around the moon for the first time in many years. And there's another first. The crew will include a woman, Christina Cook. So what does it mean to her?
To me, there's not really an individual accomplishment or achievement to talk about that isn't really, which is very little compared to the bigger thing to celebrate to me, which is the fact that we are going in an era where we have made the decision that it is important to go for all and by all. If we are not answering humanity's call to explore with all of humanity, then we're not doing it justice.
NASA worried about makeup for the first woman into space, Sally Ride. But that seems crackers now. How much have things changed?
Yeah, I think, interestingly, the human side of human spaceflight often has a lot of things like that. One thing we pick out is the hairbrush that we're going to want in space. We make sure that all of the things that we need to be comfortable living and working in a high demand environment that we have access to. And whatever that means for anyone, it's really need to be a part of an organization that recognizes that importance. So to me, that's one of the big things that has changed.
No stranger to breaking records, logging the longest continuous space flight ever by a woman.
Christina, you've been up in space before, once for 328 days. That's a long time. Did you ever get even a tiny bit bored?
I definitely never got bored. They keep us very busy and very productive. And that is one of the best things about being in space in the environment that we have right now. We are constantly trying to bring as many benefits back to Earth, whether scientific or technological, as possible. So we're very busy. Some of the things that you find out, though, is what really is important to you. What are the things that mean the most after 300 days in space? And for me, I found that something handwritten, something that was in the hands of a loved one, reaching me in space on one of our supply vehicles was one of the most meaningful things, way better than my favorite chocolate bar or anything like that. And looking down on the Earth and seeing your home, things like that are the things that make time in space for long periods of time really not only survivable, but a place where you can thrive and you can live.
This time you'll be going round the moon, but when do you think people will be back on the surface? And is it Mars next?
Yes, to answer your question, definitely. The whole eyes on Mars is what is behind this sustained lunar presence that we're going after right now. Our mission is planned for the end of next year, and that, like you mentioned, will be going around the far side of the moon with humans on the Orion vehicle for the first time ever. Then the next mission, we hope to actually land on the moon with a human landing system, a separate spacecraft. So seeing these things happen in succession is just going to be absolutely awesome. And knowing that this time we're going to stay and to carry those lessons to explore Mars is really exciting.
When?
I think, the schedule for going to Mars is in the 2030s, late 2030s. And I think the important thing is on all these missions, we'll go when the mission is ready, where it's really important that they're successful and that they don't go before the crew, the engineers, the vehicle are all ready for those missions.
Do you want to be the first person on Mars?
Of course.
What's it like walking in space?
Doing a spacewalk is a supreme honor and experience. It's like nothing that you can describe. Looking down and seeing your boots against the backdrop of a brightly lit Earth flying by at 17,500 miles per hour, 250 miles below your feet is a feeling like no other. But the real joy of it is the career culmination, bringing everything together, consolidating every skill that you've ever learned, every dream that you've ever had, and putting it there in completing this mental, physical challenge.
Okay, Christina, thank you so much for talking to us. Good luck, and please come back and tell us what it was like when you go up there.
I'd be honored to. Thank you.
There we are, hoping to be the first woman on the moon and Mars. Now, as we've talked about a lot this morning, the NHS will hit 75 years old on Wednesday, and the government spent a few days boasting about the plan to hire many thousands more doctors and nurses in the years to come. But how's that going to work when vacancies are already sky high? Well, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, is here. Welcome to you, Steve. Now, you've promised to spend an extra $2.4 billion on the start of the plan to get these more staff. Where's the cash going to come from?
Well, that ramps up. It will be announced through the normal process with the Chancellor at the next fiscal event. It's something he has long championed and been hugely supportive of, as indeed has the Prime Minister. So we've been clear as a government, we're going to prioritise what is the biggest workforce expansion in the NHS's history. It's right we do that as we mark the 75th anniversary to ensure we have the staff we need for the future. That will ramp up as we double that doctor training, so it doesn't all come in the first year, but it underscores our commitment to the NHS, and it builds on the biggest ever investment in the NHS estate, over £20 billion, which we announced as part of our new hospitals programme.
And I'd like you to be really explicit. So that £2.4 billion, is that extra money that will come from the Treasury to the Department of Health at the next budget?
It is extra money. It scales up, so it doesn't all arrive in year one. If I can explain it, as you have doctors being trained, obviously, as they go into the second year, you have double the number, into the third year, triple the number, because you're paying for the subsequent years as they come through. So the money will scale up, but it's additional money from the Treasury, and it underscores something that the Chancellor has long supported when he was doing my job, something the Prime Minister, coming from an NHS family with parents that work in the NHS, and it's part of this wider commitment from the government as we mark the 75th anniversary to invest in the NHS estate, to invest in innovation, such as our screening programmes, but also to invest in the workforce.
And the Prime Minister made it very clear to our viewers last week there isn't much money around. So are you going to borrow to get that extra cash to train these nurses and doctors?
Well, the Chancellor will announce that at the next fiscal event, so I will let him set out where that will be paid for.
But would you, as a Conservative, be happy for him to borrow in order to spend money on extra doctors and nurses?
We are making a range of decisions, and these, as a former Treasury Minister, decisions are taken in the round. So the Chancellor will set that out at the next fiscal event.
But it's an important principle, though, isn't it? Because every time we talk to a Conservative Minister, though, Health Secretary, they say we must be really careful with money. There isn't much of it about. We don't want to borrow. We're trying to get down. But in principle, as Health Secretary, would you be happy if this money was borrowed in order to spend it on training doctors and nurses, which you say we desperately need?
Well, these decisions are taken in the round, and we may come on to the discussion on pay. And part of the challenge on pay, when the junior doctors are asking for a 35% pay rise, is we do need to look at these decisions in the round. That's why we investing in the NHS estate, over £20 billion, biggest ever investment. We're investing in the biggest ever workforce expansion, but we also need to take a balanced approach to the pay negotiations as well. And I'm very pleased with the largest health group, the Agenda for Change, covering paramedics, nurses, midwives, porters, cleaners. We have reached agreement with the NHS Staff Council. That money will go into nurses' salaries this month. It reflects the huge value we place on NHS staff, but it's important we also signal the support for the future, and this workforce expansion plan gives people the confidence that the NHS will be there in a sustainable way for the long term.
But the problems are acute right now. I mean, Amanda Pritchard, the NHS boss, told us a few minutes ago that the strikes coming down the track are the most serious that we've seen. She sounded really worried about what might happen. Are you not now thinking, you know what, you just have to sort this out. You just have to get in a room. You just have to make it work.
Well, I agree with Amanda, and we're working very closely on how we mitigate the impacts of the industrial action.
But it's your job to fix this with the unions.
It is,
and the situation is getting worse. The strikes are growing when it comes to medics.
I won't accept that they're growing because we've just settled
But with medics,
the deal.
though, we have
just
consultants now saying they're going to work out.
We do, and again, we stand ready. So in terms of responding to the concerns of consultants, their number one ask was that we made changes to pension taxation. We have done that. We stand ready to have discussions. There's other things, for example, in the contract that could be reformed in the way it often values time over experience, so the pay progression through the consultant's contract. So there's things we're open to discussing. But we need, as you just touched on in terms of the workforce expansion, we need to get the balance right. It's good that we've reached an agreement with the largest group within the NHS. That will go into pay packets this month. I don't think a 35% demand from the junior doctors is affordable given our need to bring inflation down, and that matters to the NHS and to staff within it as well as it does to the wider economy.
Find an accommodation. You know, I know that's your starting position. You think that's unreasonable. They think it's reasonable, but it's your job to find an accommodation to sort this out. And why should our viewers trust you to sort out the long-term problem when you haven't been able to sort out the problems that are here with us right now, staring us in the face?
Well, I've just given you two concrete examples of problems that we have addressed. The pension tax reforms was a key demand, a hugely generous offer to NHS medics. Well, a hugely generous offer, so we have acted and listened on that. And the biggest health union, we have reached a deal, a 5% settlement plus a lump sum, recognising the huge pressure that staff within the NHS have been under. But that's not all we're doing. For example, if I look at primary care, we had a manifesto commitment to recruit an extra 26,000 staff. We've beaten that. We've now got 29 additional roles. That helps patients get the care from the specialists they need as quickly as possible. We're also investing in Pharmacy First so people can access care quicker there, and we're on track to deliver our manifesto commitment in terms of extra nurses.
But you are not going to deliver on what many people would say is the biggest problem of all on social care. And I think right now there's still around 13,000 people in beds in hospital who do not need to be there because there isn't care for them in the community. When are you going to sort out social care? Can you commit today to having a plan, at least in the next Tory manifesto?
Well, we discussed this very issue last time on the show, and it is absolutely important, and that is why it was the flagship measure of the autumn statement, up to 7.5 billion additional money over 2 years that the Chancellor announced. But it's also about how we innovate. It's also about how we innovate and deliver services differently. And that is about the career progression within the NHS. We announced in April 250 million for work on that. But it's also about getting teams within the NHS working more closely together. And let me give you a practical example of that. When I was up in Hull at the Jean Bishop Integrated Care Centre, one of the things staff were saying to me was, instead of emails and phone calls between health and social care, bringing those teams together to work in an integrated way was something that was much more effective for the patients, but also much more enjoyable for the teams themselves. So we need to deliver differently. Our reforms in 2022, bringing health and social care together through the integrated care boards, is all part of that much wider integration between health and social care.
Okay, just finally, people have seen overnight quite disturbing pictures of things that are going on in France, riots in the southern city of Marseille. And I'd ask this question because there'll be lots of people looking at that now and, you know, planning their summer holidays and thinking, should I go? Should Brits travel to France at the moment?
Well, it's something the Foreign Office is monitoring extremely closely. They keep very regular updates on the FCO website. So what I would urge viewers is to look at the Foreign Office guidance that will be updated on a regular basis, and that will give people the information they need.
Okay, Health Secretary Steve Barclay, thanks very much indeed for coming in on a busy week for you. Now, it is nearly 10 o'clock, a few days before the NHS hits its 75th birthday, as we've been hearing. And we started at the beginning of the programme asking if you can have confidence in plans to make the service fit for the future. The Chief Executive, Amanda Pritchard, acknowledged that there were challenges right now, but she also wanted to emphasise how society and the health service is changing. Let's see what our panel reckons. I suppose, James, do you feel more or less confident now at the end of our hour together?
I thought Amanda put it well. I was worried for the way that she described the state of the NHS today. What she said very clearly was that the NHS is being scapegoated for a lot of the problems that are in our society, in the illness and the essential health of our people, and it's just not coping, it's not able to keep up. And although there are good things going on in the NHS and the framework for the workforce is a good thing, the gap between the resources that are going in today and the growing needs of the NHS is just huge.
What about, Michael, though, our own responsibility? I mean, you all kind of agreed that basically business needs to be more tightly regulated to help, to help the population be more healthy. But what about all of us?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, we have personal responsibility, but also without a doubt that if you change the framework, it changes how people behave. Smoking did not come down. When I was a medical student, about half the population smoked. Now it's down about 18, 90%, something like that. That was not because people suddenly discovered willpower and decided they didn't want to smoke. It's because they made it really expensive, really difficult, and then they banned it in places. So that is what really changes things. And the same thing is true of ultra-processed food. If you make it cheap, easily accessible, and available everywhere, people will eat it. And this stuff is horribly addictive.
Iban.
Well, I thought the story of this morning was really about how we treat our professional in schools, in the NHS, and I was really struck by the astronaut Christine Cook saying that her job brought every skill and every dream together, and I didn't hear anything like that from anybody in power about the teachers, about the NHS staff. We need to think bigger.
Well, we can look to female astronauts for inspiration in the future. Thank you, all three of you, very much. And you have been sharing your thoughts too, as we like you to do. Joan got in touch to say, I was so annoyed to hear Rishi Sunak's speech about the government giving the NHS £2.4 billion in England, because in Northern Ireland, where she lives, our budget has been cut dramatically and senior civil servants are having to make tough decisions. Of course, there's not a functioning government instrument at the moment. David has got in touch to say, I'm a 72-year-old who'd never have seen the light of day if it hadn't have been for the NHS care given to my mum way back in 1951. We have to preserve the NHS, even if it means increased taxation, according to David. And Gordon shared his experience of working in the NHS as a consultant physician until 2022. He said, the processes I had to work in were so inefficient. The paperwork was bad, the computer work no better. And neither government nor the profession talk about this, and both now say more staff is the answer. But the workplace is so efficient and time consuming. Well, Gordon closing his thought then with computer says no. IT is one thing that drives all of us mad, doesn't it? A lot to think about this morning. Thank you so much for all your emails and messages, and of course for watching. Thank you to my panel, Bevan Kidron, James Bethell and Dr. Michael Mosley. There will be many more conversations about the health service in the next few days before its big birthday on Wednesday, but more frustrations for those waiting for treatment too, but also more displays of pride in the fact that it exists at all. And doubtless more challenges for politicians and the services managers to meet that basic conundrum we've just been talking about. Demand is bigger than supply. We want more healthcare than is really available. So how do they propose to work that out? It will always be a big part of our political conversation, because after all, healthcare is never far from the top of your list, so it's never far from the top of politicians' lists. To hear any of our conversations again, of course, you can go to iPlayer. And as ever, there is tons on BBC Online. But thank you so much for your company. Have a great Sunday and see you next week. Same time, same place.
Nobody's good at war.